Hello again. Welcome to session 5 of this webinar series, Theosophy Raw and Unfiltered from the Vedas to the Present. Today, I've titled this session, What is a Human Being? And also tying up some loose ends. The question, what is a human being, is a very important one. We saw in a previous session that Sir Francis Crick had said that it's amazing how many problems are seen in a new light when you begin to adjust yourself to the understanding that human beings are nothing but the product of chemical compounds. But of course, human beings are not nothing but the product of chemical compounds. According to the Vedas, according to the Upanishads, according to the eclectic Theosophical system, in ancient Greece, according to Plato, according to the ancient Egyptians, according to modern-day Theosophy, the authors of the Mahatma letters, all of these would argue that human beings are not just the product of chemical compounds. The body may be a product of chemical compounds, but human beings and even the material world is the product of pure divine intelligence. So I'd like to take a little look today more closely at what is a human being. We've already seen that from a number of angles, from the Vedanta point of view, from the point of view of the Aryan philosophy, taking a kind of a top-down approach, looking at your real self, the self that you really are, which is Atma. And many of our problems, in fact, all of our problems, according to Vedanta and the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, are caused by our fundamental lack of knowledge of the real self. The real self, the self that you really are, is purna, full. It is not lacking anything. It is not wanting anything. And therefore, someone in a state of self-realization, for example, would be okay with whatever happened. And there are so many examples of that, of Ramana having very painful bone cancer and really not minding and worrying, being concerned more for the welfare of his disciples who were very worried and wanting him to get treatment and whatnot. But he had his consciousness settled elsewhere. And so the body to him was really like a passing show. And that takes a lot of pain out of our pain when you can observe the body from that state of independence, from that state of kaivalya or isolation, as it is called in the Yoga Sutras. A lot of the pain disappears. There's just the physical pain. There is not the psychological pain that compounds everything for us. So one of the things that I would like to clear up is a couple of, I think I made a couple of mistakes in passing last time. I may have described this chart from the section 2, book 2 of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. I may have described this as a summary of the whole of the teaching of the Yoga Sutras. I'm not sure, but I might have said that. In fact, this is a summary or a chart of one of the teachings in the second book of the Yoga Sutras, and the section dealing with what is called Kriya Yoga or preparatory yoga. And this chart is something to do with Kriya Yoga. The word Kriya, like Sanskrit, is a handy language because it leaves clues to meaning all over itself. And we know that the root of the word Kriya is Kri, to do or to make, the same word from which we get the same root from which we get the word karma, which is action. The word Kri, to do or to make. And preparatory yoga is, as we will see in a moment, Taimani explains, for those who feel that they are not yet ready to make that complete and utter final ascent, which is what yoga is really all about. So this chart, which is about the attenuation of the kleshas. The kleshas, we may remember from last week, are the hindrances or afflictions. And the hindrances or afflictions besetting human beings are not external, they're all internal. And they are down at the bottom of this chart. Ignorance or avidya, attraction and repulsion towards sense objects, or we can just say all of the likes and dislikes, I amness, and the thirst for life, or the instinctive sense of self-preservation. These are the afflictions besetting us throughout all of our lives. And everything that we do and every thought that we have, every step that we take is founded on these subconscious impressions resulting from past deeds, mainly conditioned by avidya, attraction and repulsion towards objects, I amness, and the sense of instinctive self-preservation. And we've got two tracks here we were talking about last week. There is the road to rebirth, samsara, the wheel of birth and death, or the road to kaivalya, liberation. And we saw last week that in the Yoga Sutras we learn that every day, every life, every moment, every action, every thought is going one way or the other. You can't go both these ways at the same time. So you are either on the road back to attachment to the wheel of birth and death, or you're on the road leading to final liberation. Now, rebirth and liberation here, we normally think of birth and death as the opposites, birth and death. But here, birth is not the opposite of death, it is the opposite of liberation. In other words, rebirth here is really death in Vedanta and yoga. Rebirth is what is described, if we take the Shanti mantra from Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad and At the Feet of the Master, lead me from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. Here we've got immortality on the right of this chart and death on the left. Death meaning death of awareness, so the contrast here is not between living and dying or life and death. The contrast here is between ordinary, mediocre living and living as we might be living, like really alive, living in a state of awareness and happiness, a state of Sat Chit Ananda. That is actually the human potential. But the ordinary round on the wheel of birth and death is just to keep repeating the same old thought patterns, the same old beliefs, conditioning our actions in the same old way, and therefore creating a deeper and deeper groove of what is really death compared to the full life that we could be living. Since last week, I've then summarized this whole chart and whole teaching with the aid of that great Indo-Aryan bard, Bob Dylan. And you can see on the side there, it says, those who are not busy being born are busy dying. Those not busy being born are busy dying. And I'm pretty sure that Bob Dylan also didn't mean those not busy being born as in taking birth again and again. I think what he must have meant, those not busy being born creatively, those not being busy born into aliveness, are busy dying. So while technically speaking he's not a great Indo-Aryan bard, he does speak in English, which is an Indo-Aryan language, and he is a great bard, so I'm not too far off there. In the preface to the Science of Yoga, Taimani summarized what Kriya Yoga is all about. And I love this quote because it says so much about the path as it is understood in the Theosophical Society. He says, those who do not feel themselves equal to this task, and this task is really liberation, self-realization, yoga as in yoga chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of the modifications of the mind, really totally liberating oneself from the mind, which he had just previously to this quote said is a really major undertaking. It is not the work of a moment or a day. It is a life's work. And he says here, those who do not feel themselves equal to this task are not under any compulsion to attempt it immediately. They can continue the theoretical study of yoga. So those who are not ready to really practice yoga, they can continue the theoretical study of yoga, think constantly over life's deeper problems, try to purify their mind and strengthen their character, until their power of discrimination becomes sufficiently strong to enable them to pierce through ordinary illusions and see life in its naked reality. Until their power of discrimination is sufficiently strong to enable them to pierce through ordinary illusions and see life in its naked reality. That means that their power of discrimination is sufficiently strong to enable them to see beyond the Maya, to see beyond Mithya, to see beyond the falsity of the world, to see beyond the projection of the world onto that pure white screen, that deep empty space onto which the world is projected, just like our thoughts are a projection onto the deep silent space within. The world is a projection onto silent, deep space. And it takes a lot of discrimination or discernment or power of seeing to be able to see the difference between the self and its objects, the self and the sensory world. But at some point, through cleaning up the mud in our lake by the theoretical study of this tradition, thinking constantly over life's deeper problems, purifying the mind and strengthening the character, that hones our skills of discernment as well. And that is Kriya Yoga. This is the purpose of Kriya Yoga. And then he goes on to say, when the inner eyes of true discrimination begin to open as a result of the practice of Kriya Yoga, they will cease to wonder whether they are strong enough to undertake this long and difficult journey to their true homes. So that is really, I just wanted to clarify the status of Kriya Yoga in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And before we move away from this chart altogether, I would like to say something else about samsara or rebirth. I suggested a moment ago that we're not speaking about rebirth as being the problem. Rebirth, or being alive, being born, living in the material world, is not actually the problem. The problem is samsara. And the word samsara, of course, literally means with that which moves, the world of movement, as opposed to the self, which does not move. So the material world is samsara. But another way of looking at samsara, which I found very useful, I got from a talk by Swami Paramarthananda in Chennai, where he described samsara as a syndrome consisting of 3 interrelated ailments. A syndrome consisting of 3 interrelated ailments, and they were attachment, sorrow, and delusion. Attachment, sorrow, and delusion. So attachment comes about because we do not know the real self. Because the full self is not known, we are attached to things, we are attached to people, we are attached to places. Through this sense of lack, there is this attachment. That is the fundamental problem in samsara, is attachment, or one of the fundamental problems. This then gives rise naturally to sorrow, because whatever we are attached to, we will lose. Attachment and sorrow inevitably lead also to delusion. And by delusion, he means wrong thinking, wrong judgments. When the mind is suffering, when the mind is full of sorrow, when the mind is full of attachments, it cannot see straight. And I've made so many errors in my life simply because I thought what I was about to do was okay, and in fact a really good idea and necessary, because I really wanted it. And in fact, it was not okay, it was not a good idea, and it was not necessary. So, delusion. So samsara, the problem here on the left is not being born, being alive, it is samsara. And one way of thinking of samsara, which is a little unusual, but I think very useful, is it is a syndrome consisting of three illnesses: attachment, sorrow, and delusion. Another thing I would like to just clarify from last week before we move on, this slogan at the top of this slide, an ignorance virus can be killed only by one medicine, and that is knowledge. I attributed that for some slip-of-the-tongue reason last time to Swami Prabhavananda in California, and no longer with us, I think. No, certainly. And it was actually something I got from a talk by Swami Paramarthananda in Chennai. And he said an ignorance virus, or avidya, can be killed only by one medicine, and that is knowledge. And the statement below it is from Shankaracharya's Atma Bodha. As fire is the direct cause of cooking, so knowledge, and not any other discipline, is the direct cause of liberation. For liberation cannot be attained without knowledge. This is one of the most controversial statements and teachings in Vedanta, and it is also a source of quite a lot of controversy in the Theosophical Society, because this seems to be something different to what we normally think of as the path. As fire is the direct cause of cooking, so knowledge, and not any other discipline, is the direct cause of liberation. For liberation cannot be attained without knowledge. Now we can see from a very small understanding of Kriya Yoga in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras that yes, yoga is the direct knowledge. Yoga is the union. Yoga is the goal. Yoga is what is there when there are no modifications of the mind. But there are indirect aids. Only that leads to liberation. But indirectly, there is Kriya Yoga. Indirectly, there are lots of things that you can do which indirectly lead to liberation. And that was also Shankaracharya's teaching. Action cannot destroy ignorance, for it is not in conflict with ignorance. Knowledge alone destroys ignorance as light destroys darkness. But the fundamental problems that are obstructing us from this knowledge can be attenuated, can be thinned out. And that's where our spiritual practices, sadhana, meditation, and all of that, the place that they play, relatively speaking, in this scheme. The ultimate truth, the highest truth really is that no action leads to liberation. Not even right action leads to liberation. But actions thin out, the fundamental hindrances. Some of our actions can mire us even further in a hole, and other actions dredge the lake, dredge the mud from the lake. So now let's move on. The heat, Ed is saying, yes, it seems to me that the heat is the cause of cooking, not just fire. But we could argue that heat is also part of the Agni Tattva, the fire element. It is heat. The fire applies heat to the meal, and that is why you get cooking instead of raw salad or gazpacho. So now I've tried to sort out a bit of the mess that I created last week. And so now we move on to this session proper, beginning with a statement by H.P. Blavatsky from an essay of hers, I think it was, Spiritual Progress. H.P. Blavatsky's Spiritual Progress, which is an excellent essay to read for a number of reasons. She says in there, whatever differences are to be found in the various presentations of the esoteric doctrine, yet in every one of them we find the fullest agreement upon one point, the road to spiritual development. one only inflexible rule has ever been binding on the neophyte, as it is binding now, the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher. So whatever differences are to be found in the presentations of the esoteric doctrine, in all of them, there has ever been but one road to spiritual development, one inflexible rule, one way, and that is the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher. Now, before we move on to read the rest of that statement or quote, I would like to hone in on where she says the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher. Because I think this is one typical example or possible example of where the unwary could easily misunderstand what is said here without a background knowledge of Vedanta, the Aryan philosophy, and all the things that we've been speaking about in this webinar. What is meant by the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher? The word subjugation implies a kind of force, it implies force. It implies a kind of a control of the lower nature by the higher. But in fact, it is not so much a subjugation of the lower nature by the higher, it is more an awareness of our higher natures. That is the only way of actually subjugating the lower nature. The lower nature cannot be subjugated by an effort of the will, as we will see a little bit later. That is impossible. It is in fact a takeover by the higher nature. It is a realization of one's higher nature. It is an opening to the higher nature. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But this is one of these things, like the quote at the beginning of the webinar series from the letter of the Mahachohan, where it says, each of us must give up our own ego, the illusory apparent self, to find our life in the transcendental divine life, something like that. Each of us must give up our ego, the illusory apparent self. The illusory apparent self, that's not a value judgment. That's more like a kind of a set of coordinates. It's a noun, the illusory apparent self. It is not a verb. Same here, the lower nature. It's not lower as in a value judgment. It's the lower nature as in a part of our geometry, a part of one of our bodies is the lower nature, and the higher is another body or vehicle. To go on now, from the Vedas and the Upanishads to the recently published Light on the Path, search as we may through the Bibles of every race and cult, we find but one only way, hard, painful, troublesome, by which man can gain the true spiritual insight. And how can it be otherwise, since all religions and all philosophies are but the variants of the first teachings of the one wisdom imparted to men at the beginning of the cycle by the planetary spirit. So here she's saying there is only one way by which we can ascend to or gain true spiritual insight, and that is the complete subjugation of the lower nature by the higher, or the complete surrender to the higher, or complete awareness of the higher, or complete discernment of the higher. And then at the end here, she says something very interesting. How can it be otherwise, since all religions and all philosophies are but the variants of the first teachings of the one wisdom imparted to men at the beginning of the cycle by the planetary spirit? Now, I wonder if you remember that I think it was in the first session, Jim asked a question, something like, where do these teachings come from? Where did the Vedas come from? Ancient, 8,000 BC. And where did they come from? Where did the rishis get the teachings in the Vedas from? And here, in a sense, we have an answer to that. The rishis were given the teachings that ended up in the Vedas by the planetary spirit at the beginning of the cycle. So now I'd like to say a little bit about what does that mean at the beginning of the cycle? Because it has a lot of implications for, it helps to explain a lot of things, not just why so long ago we had this perfect wisdom, and since then we seem to be nothing but falling away from it. Things seem to just start off perfect and get degraded, just like in the second law of thermodynamics. Everything is running down. So in the certainly every Oriental civilization, and I think every ancient civilization had some kind of a theory of cosmic cycles, which in the Aryan tradition is the four yugas, is part of this overall theory of cosmic cycles. And I'd like to read a little bit that I prepared and didn't put into slides about that, and I think we will find it useful. I think you will find it useful. So at the beginning of this cycle, the planetary spirit, maybe Dian Shohan's or just pure boundless intelligence, transferred to humanity at the beginning of this cycle the summation of knowledge from the previous cycle. It's like a reincarnation of knowledge, in a sense. And the theory of the yugas, we all know that we are living in the Kali Yuga, which is the last of the ages, the lowest order, the Iron Age. But the cycles begin with a golden age, which is a conundrum. Why do the cycles begin with a golden age? You know, we've all been conditioned to think of the arrow of time, and time moves forward. So there is a progress of movement, moving forward in time. But maybe time is not an arrow, time is a circle. And the circle begins, or doesn't begin, but part of the circle is the golden age, the Krita Yuga. This is the longest in duration. It's in fact 4 times the length of time as the Kali Yuga. And in the golden age, perfect justice ruled the world. There were no laws even. Everything was in a state of harmony, so there was no need for any kind of laws. There was no Kriya Yoga. There were no spiritual practices. Happiness and justice were the order of the day, and morality ruled the universe. Everything just happened spontaneously, and everybody was okay with whatever happened. Nothing was forced. Then in the second age, the Treta Yuga, this is a retrograde step and lasting 3 times as less, so only 3/4 of the golden age. The Treta Yuga, the Silver Age, lasted only 3 times what three-thirds of the Golden Age, that retrograde step. And there, at that time, was the beginning of a sense of justice. There was a need for some kind of understanding of moral order, because it was not spontaneous. There was already a falling away from truth in the Treta Yuga. Then comes the Dvapara Yuga, lasting half the time of the Golden Age, and only half of the Dharma survived the transition. So half of the Dharma that had been given to us at the beginning had survived into the Dvapara Yuga. In this stage, evil is increasing. Evil was born in the Treta Yuga. In the Dvapara Yuga, it starts to increase. It starts to gain ground. It starts to take over. And human life becomes shorter and more brutish. I'm not making this up. This is actually from the teachings that exist on the 4 ages. And then Kali Yuga, our own times. In the Kali Yuga, only 1/4 of the moral order is observed, and society has reached the extremes of degradation. In the words of the Vishnu Purana, the Kali Yuga is the age in which property alone confers social rank. Wealth becomes the motive of the passions, and falsehood is the precondition of success in life. That's an excellent description of the times in which we live. In the Vishnu Purana, it says, the Kali Yuga is the age in which property alone confers social rank. Wealth becomes the motive of the passions, and falsehood is the precondition of success in life. We will see in a moment the significance of what is it that is the motive of the passions. Different things can be the motive of the passions. For example, mumukshutva, the strong urge for liberation, the longing for liberation, can become the motive of our passions, or wealth can become the motive of our passions. There will always be our passions, but it just depends. A lot hangs on what is their motive. And a lot hangs on what we believe we really are, what we believe the human being really is. So we've been living in Kali Yuga for several thousand years. The exact amount of time doesn't really matter for present purposes. The life of a single universe is made up of numerous such cycles, each going through the same 4 stages, followed by a dissolution or a pralaya. At the end of each age, there is a dissolution, when, as in the death of the human being, all the characteristics and tendencies are taken up into a kind of a seed, which will regerminate in the next age or next life, whatever the case may be. At the end of a great age, or Mahayuga, there is a corresponding Mahapralaya, in which all forms and all modes of existence reabsorb into undifferentiated matter, or primordial matter. And then again, at the beginning of another age, everything that was absorbed into that undifferentiated prakriti, or undifferentiated matter, starts to unfold, starts to differentiate. And that is how matter is created. How matter isn't really created, matter unfolds. So the question is often asked, naturally enough, why are the ages running down? If we began knowing everything, carrying the Dharma in its entirety, if we actually existed in a state of self-realization, why did we move away from that? How did we lose that? Why did we fall from grace? Almost every civilization has had some notion of a golden age in its distant past. And furthermore, this pattern seems to conform to entropy law, the entropy law in physics. The universe is running down, and order increases over time. According to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe was in a state of high order at one end of time. The end we call the past, said Stephen Hawking. The universe was in a state of high order at one end of time, the time we call the past. Now, the time we call the past isn't necessarily in the past. Chronologically, it's not necessarily in the past in a straight arrow going from the past to the future. That's the arrow of time. But what if time is not an arrow, it's a circle? If time is a circle, there is no end. The past is not an end. The past is somewhere on that circle. And as it happens, the past, the Kali Yuga, which is the extreme of degradation, is right next to the golden age on that circle. You know, after the Kali Yuga, at the end of the Kali Yuga, there will be a reabsorption into a state of undifferentiated matter. There will be a pralaya. And the next thing to emerge out of the one after the Kali Yuga is the golden age. So there is a very close link between the extreme of degradation and perfect Sat Chit Ananda. From the moment of the birth of the universe, the Big Bang, the universe has been expanding and disorder has been increasing. The disorder of physics, Stephen Hawking explained, is nothing other than movement itself. The disorder of the universe is just movement. We start from no movement, and then movement begins, expanding outward, and disorder increases. Disorder is just movement. An exchange of energy upon which our lives depend utterly. So without movement, there is nothing happening. It's the same with thought. Thought is a movement in time, and something is happening. In the stillness, in some ways, nothing is happening, but the stillness is primary. The stillness is that out of which the thought moves and is resolved. There's constant in-breathing and out-breathing. One of the problems with us is that we are aware only of the level of thought. We're not really aware of the silent, deep silent space from which these thoughts emerge. Anyway, in both Big Bang theory and the theory of cyclic time, when disorder reaches its outer limits, a contraction begins to take place. And eventually, the central point of complete order is reached once again. At that point, there is a dissolution of all forms. There is a dissolution of all matter. And the universe is reabsorbed once again into undifferentiated matter until such a time as there is another outbreathing in another cycle. So the cosmic cycles don't follow the same pattern as the arrow of time. And that is one reason why we can start off in a state of Sat Chit Ananda, where there isn't even a need for the concept of justice. There is no what we call evil, evil being just a movement away from the self, away from the one, away from the totality. In a way, in a strange way, what we call evil is nothing but motion. We don't take that literally, but there is stillness and there is movement. I'm reminded there of what Plato, who said, time is the moving face of eternity. There's time and there's eternity, and time is the moving face of eternity. It's not really separate, but it's different. It's motion. And this world is the world of motion. And in the world of motion, disorder expands. Disorder always increases. And Kali Yuga is the extreme of disorder. We are now living in the extreme of disorder. So things can only get better from here. Okay, what is a human being? So this is a human being. There's not a lot of detail here because what we're looking at is just the surface of the human being. There's some detail. We can see 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth. They've got arms and legs. They can move around. They can hang on to things. They have opposable thumbs. They have reproductive organs, which for some reason the males choose to carry around on the outside. So this is a human being, but with not much detail. What happens if we slice one open, like in an anatomy class? Only in this case, spiritual anatomy. Spiritual anatomy 101. What does the human being look like? This is one way of showing what the human being looks like. Now don't panic, we're not going to go through this whole slide, and it doesn't matter if you can't read it all, because I'll go through what's relevant for this present session, or try to do that. This is where you see me digging myself out of a very deep hole that I dug by deciding to go through this chart. Oh, thank you, Jim. You're an angel. Oh, Pablo, someone. So many people in the Theosophical Society would have seen various versions of the septenary division or the septenary constitution of the human being, or the 7 planes of existence and the 7 bodies of man. And here we can see under the column here, functioning principles, a fairly typical classification. This chart I'm using was created by Eddie Bilimoria, and it combines several different versions of the bodies of man from different traditions. So esoteric Buddhism, Vedanta, and Taraka Raja Yoga. But here, the functioning principles, we begin with, let's look at the dense physical body, which is what we saw in the picture a moment ago, the dense physical body, called in Vedanta Annamaya Kosha. Annamaya Kosha, oh, we've got an arrow. Am I supposed to be able to move that arrow? Yeah. Annamaya Kosha, from the word Anna, meaning food. The dense physical body, the Annamaya Kosha, is the body which takes in food, as in breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The different bodies have different foods, or hold different things, or consist of different things. The dense physical body, the Annamaya Kosha, is the body that is built up largely on breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The word kosha means sheath. So each of these bodies is also a sheath containing a higher force, just like you put a blade into a sword into a sheath. The dense physical body is the sheath. The sword is above. The sword is what is in that sheath. So, and ultimately, the sword, which is the Atman, has all these sheaths. The higher is always contained in the lower. So the lower is the outer vesture of the higher. So the dense physical body is called the Annamaya Kosha because it is the body which is made up of food, as in breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Then there is an etheric force or a life principle in that body and surrounding that body, contained within that body. And that is made up of prana, or energy, the pranamaya kosha, the energy body. Prana is energy, the life breath. Prana actually is a very deep concept, meaning not just breathing, not just the breathing of the physical body, but the energy of the entire organism is in the pranamaya kosha. And then there's the kama rupa, kama as in desire. This is the body containing, this is where all our passions go. You know, this is where all our passions are housed. And those passions can be higher or lower. It might be the passion for liberation. It might be the passion to serve, or it might be the passion for wealth. In the Kali Yuga, the passions are mainly passions for wealth. In the Treta Yuga, the second age, the passions are mainly for justice, wholeness, harmony, perhaps. So I'd like to skip a slide here. So the physical body is the house in which the entire human being rides. The physical body is the horse on which we ride. The physical body is the way that the self that you really are interacts with the world. Now, when we say that the self, the Atma, interacts with the world, we have to be very careful, because the self interacts with the world, but also always remains completely independent from the world. It's like that being in the world but not of it. The self is in the world in only some senses. It is always not of it. The lower mind and the higher mind, this is an example of splitting things up, which in some ways are not split up at all. There is only one mind. It is higher or lower depending on where it is attending, what it is attending to, where its interest lies. HPB described Buddhimana somewhere as heaven aspiring. It's the inward turned, the contemplative, intuitive mind. The word buddhi means awake. It comes from the word bud, to awake. So the Buddha was awakened. And that state of being awake exists right now in every one of us in the functioning principle of the human being known as buddhi, which is the spiritual intelligence. It is very close in nature to Atma or the Atman. I mean, to all intents and purposes, we needn't even distinguish between them. We can see on the right here where it's got the qualities of consciousness displayed or manifested. Atma is pure consciousness, as in Sat Chit Ananda. Boundless existence, intelligence and bliss. And buddhi is very close in nature to the above, and it is experienced as pure awareness, the silent watcher. So there are in the human being various faculties. The mental faculty, the awareness faculty, and just pure contentless consciousness. These are all faculties, and the lower quaternary consists of what we call bodies, but bodies not in the usual sense, sorry about this. Bodies as in functions. They're not strictly speaking locations, although they are locations in one sense. Very important thing to point out here, which is quite interesting. The physical body, which is where the brain is a physical organ. That is not where the mind is. That is not where our thoughts are. Our thoughts cannot be in the brain, which is a physical organ, because our thoughts are manas. The mind is not in the brain. The brain is not the same as the mind. Where do our thoughts go? Our thoughts don't get housed in the brain. What about thought transference? If I pick up on your thoughts, does that mean I pick your brain? Do I slice your brain open and take thoughts in thought transference? No, I pick up on them from where they are, which is in another body, a more subtle body. And these three, the etheric body, the kama rupa, and the lower mind, in fact the mind, the manomaya kosha, these are the subtle bodies in the Vedanta yoga classification. There is the physical body, there are the subtle bodies, and then there is the self. Now, why am I saying all this? Okay. At the top of the chart of the functioning principles, there's a very important fact, a very important teaching, that the subject-object relation emerges only when mind emerges from the universe. Manas emerges in cosmological terms now. Manas is something that emerges at a rather late stage of unfoldment of the universe. At a rather late stage of development, cosmologic of the cosmos, does mind emerge. Until mind emerges, and mind is the subject-object relation, there is no observer and observed. There is only pure awareness as witnessing. I wonder, Jim, can we go back to the previous format of this? Yes. I'm getting a little bit disturbed by not seeing what I used to see here. And why is that important? An important fact for us to imbibe, that mind, thought, the subject-object relation, emerges at a late stage of development. That is because if we look at this constitution of the human being, the physical body, the desire body, the mental body, buddhi and atma, if we look at this as a chart, which it can be looked at as a chart of how the physical world was created, because this is not just the bodies of the human being, this is also the planes of existence. The physical plane is the last one to be created. The physical plane is the last one to emerge from the totality. The physical body, my physical body, is also the end result of a lot of other things. My physical body is the end result of my thoughts. My physical body is the end result of my passions. My physical body is the end result of prana. So the physical is the least significant element in some ways. We can almost say from a healing point of view that the physical and illness that emerges into the physical body was first somewhere else. And the most sure way of curing any illness is to cure it at its source. You know, the real cause of the illness is not just physical. We know that it's also emotional and it's mental. So, but also, if mind or manas emerged at a later stage of development in the world, in the creation, then we logically must have to believe that we all already possess pure awareness. Atma and Buddhi were there first. So before mind emerged as a faculty, the subject-object relation, there was already awareness. So that awareness that awareness is what we really are prior to thinking. And prior, not just in chronology, but prior right now. Underneath thinking is this awareness. Now, unfortunately, I've taken a rather long time for this on this chart. I did say that it was going to be interesting to see if I could dig myself out of this hole, and I haven't really dug myself out of this hole yet, so let's proceed. This is a quote by Annie Besant, which I think I took from one of Pablo's talks. The way to begin to tread the path that leads to the place of peace is to endeavor to identify our consciousness with the true self. The way to begin to tread the path that leads to the place of peace is to identify our consciousness with the true self. And the means are disengagement from the objects of the senses, carelessness as to results, and meditation ever renewed on the true self. Now, it may not be obvious here that Annie Besant is really speaking pure Vedanta yoga here. She is reiterating so much of what has been said in these sessions. The place of peace actually is the true self. My true self is the place of peace. My true self is Sat Chit Ananda. And the more I identify with that aspect of my being, the more I am aware of that aspect of my being, that is the path. And the means include disengagement from the objects of the senses, which means disengagement from the falsity of the world, from mithya. Remember, some sessions ago, there was a definition given of the word divine as turning away from the outer surface of the sensory world. So the divine is turning away from the outer sensory, the surface of sensory objects. So disengagement from the objects of the senses. Carelessness as to results is something that she must have got from recently translating the Bhagavad Gita. Carelessness as to results does not mean carelessness in the usual sense of the word, like you don't care how much you stuff up by what you do. Carelessness as to results is one of the main teachings of the Gita, which is to do what is right and not worry about the consequences. Don't look for the fruits of your actions. So it is not looking for the fruits of your actions. Find out what it is right to do and do that. And don't worry whether you can see good results or not. And meditation ever renewed on the true self. Meditation ever renewed on the true self, but not as a theory. If we can actually meditate, in order to meditate on the true self, you need to see the true self, which is not such an easy thing to do. It requires a considerable amount of discernment, and it means getting the middleman out of the way. You know, a lot of the problems that we have are in the middle of the chart, the lower mind, the higher mind. The rest is okay. It's the middleman that's the problem. Now, I've taken a little bit too long, so I'm going to just skip ahead here. What I'd like to do now is something fairly radical. I can move that arrow. This chart is what Herman Daly, the steady state economist, called the ends-means spectrum. I've just reconfigured it slightly, but in the 1970s, the steady state economist, Herman Daly, wrote an essay that I have found that is very, very profound and quite useful to know about in the Theosophical Society, I think. He pointed out this is the ends-means spectrum. So everything that there is created along this ends-means spectrum. Everything that we have created in this material world is made up of ultimate means, low entropy matter energy. Low entropy matter energy is the ultimate means out of which every physical thing is made. We have not created low entropy matter energy. We can only use it wisely. It is intrinsically limited. There is a limited amount of low entropy matter energy out of which everything in this universe is made. Then the ultimate end at the end of the spectrum, he's got ultimate end question mark. I love the way he had ultimate end question mark, the summum bonum, the ultimate good, but not defined. You know, maybe it's God, maybe it's, I don't know what anybody would put there as in ultimate end. In Vedanta, the ultimate end is Atma. And in the seven planes diagram, in the seven bodies of the human being, the ultimate means is the physical body. The ultimate end, the highest good, your real self, is Atma. Then in the middle here, in the Herman Daly's ends-means spectrum, the intermediate means are labor. Everything that we do in this world is made out of low entropy matter energy through labor and through the stock of artifacts, the equipment, the other things that we made before. So we use low entropy matter energy by labor to attend to our intermediate ends, which is in theory to provide food, clothing, shelter, drinking water, education, health and well-being for all. And the political economy is all about distributing scarce means among competing ends. Distributing scarce means among competing ends. Now we've also got competing ends ourselves. You know, we've got, you know, some of my disciples, some of my thoughts have ends which I think are very intelligent. But some of my thoughts have different ends. You know, some of my thoughts are concerned with wealth. Well, not so much wealth, but more like survival. Some of my thoughts are not interested in that at all. So I've got competing ends as well. And all of my efforts in life are geared towards distributing the limited means at my disposal among these competing ends. Things start to work a lot better when we don't have so many competing ends, but are more one-focused. But now this is the interesting thing. No, you can't read that chart. You don't need to read it, because we remember what is there. At the bottom was the dense physical body, and at the top was the Atman. So I've placed this alongside Herman Daly's ends-means spectrum for a very special reason. Low entropy matter energy was not created by human beings. It was created by the ultimate end question mark, which in Vedanta and in Theosophy we know as Atma. So looking back at the chart on the left, the dense physical body, and in fact all of those faculties, were created directly by Atma. Directly, the dense physical body was created by Atma. Atma created low entropy matter energy. Maybe created is not the right word, but the dense physical body is a direct product of Atma, of pure, unconditioned intelligence. The dense what I would have liked to put on this slide is a direct semicircle leading from dense physical body to Atma. Because right at this very moment, the material universe, low entropy matter energy, is being sustained by the self, isn't it? The dense physical body is sustained by something that is not itself. The dense physical body is sustained by the higher, and ultimately it is sustained by Atma. I believe, and this is a belief, I believe, and there is a lot of spiritual teachings or teachings about spirituality to back it up, that the real problem does not lie in that low entropy matter energy may be limited, but magic can happen there. You know, when the mind becomes more the higher mind, and then becomes a tool in the hand of God, a pen in the hand of God or the self, a lot of problems can disappear overnight. You know, a lot of healing can take place magically. There was an interview, David Suzuki, the environmental journalist, interviewed the physicist and philosopher David Bohm and on a Canadian radio once. And at the end of the interview, David Bohm related a story, and he said that once Krishnji, in a dialogue, in one of their dialogues, Krishnji said, "I'd like to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer that question strictly from the point of view of your knowledge as a scientist, and not as a philosopher or based on the sort of things that we've been talking about. I would like you to tell me, answer this question from the point of view of quantum, just from physics as a scientist." And the question was, what if I were to say to you that everything can change in a moment? You know, what if I were to say to you that everything can change instantly? And David Bohm said, yes. So what Krishnji meant by everything can change instantly was that with one total shift in focus, the material reality could change. The material reality, the low entropy matter energy, the physical plane, the ecological problems, the global warming, the the threat of imminent nuclear war. Everything can change instantly. And in fact, it's that level of change that really works. It's the, there's this constant question. There's a question that always comes up with people who are interested in transformation, enlightenment, what have you. The old chestnut, I think you call it, is enlightenment instant? Is it spontaneous? Is enlightenment instant, or is it gradual? Is enlightenment instant, or is it gradual? Well, enlightenment is always instant. The preparation may be gradual, but enlightenment is always instant. And because Atma, Buddhi, and Buddhi Manas are faculties that we possess right now, it just stands to reason that you don't need to go through a whole lot of preparation. You don't need to go through a whole lot of practice. You could become aware of that right now. And it's that which Krishnaji said, everything could change in an instant. And David Bohm went on to teach in many different fora that thought affects the material reality. Thought affects material reality. So the problem in this chart on the left is with the middleman, is with the thinker. It depends, everything depends on which way the thinker is focused. And here I've gone over time. I'm terribly sorry. But I'm just going to end with putting this whole thing in an easier picture. This is a picture of the ideal situation. The ideal situation. So the chariot is the body in which we ride. So the chariot in the Katha Upanishad and in Plato's Republic, there is this metaphor of the chariot and the chariot driver. And so the chariot is the body. The manas, the mental faculty, are the reins. And the reins, the mental faculty, manas, is guiding the horses. The horses are the senses and also the paths on which the horses ride. So the horses are going left, right, and all over the place, determined entirely by the reins, which is the mind. So where you want to go, where your focus is where the horses are going to be going. Now in this picture depicting the ideal situation, the driver holding the reins, the driver holding the mental faculty, the driver holding the subject-object faculty, the thinking faculty, is spiritual intelligence. This is the ideal situation. The owner of the chariot, by the way, is Atma. So Atma owns this chariot and has engaged the spiritual intelligence to drive the mental faculty to go where we should be going. This is the ideal situation where my chariot is being driven by my spiritual intelligence or our spiritual intelligence. And this is Dara. I should have called this self-portrait. So the chariot in which we ride, when it is being driven by the lower mind, and the lower mind, it's not really lower and higher, it is the mind that is concerned with what in the Vishnu Purana it said, wealth, wealth, power, the mind of, I don't know what, the used car salesman or something, or my mind, Dara's mind, the lower mind. So in my case, it's not the ideal situation. Everything is the same. The horses represent the senses and the paths on which they ride. The horses are always in the reins of the mind, the mental faculty. But it just depends on who's driving this chariot. The question to ask ourselves all the time is just who is driving this chariot? And this is a question that we can ask ourselves every day, and in every situation, in every complex situation, just who is driving this chariot? Is it pure contentless consciousness? Am I coming from pure contentless consciousness? Am I coming from spiritual intelligence? Is this seeing, or is this thinking in the service of desire? Kama manas, the desire mind, is just the mental faculty in the service of desire, the outward turned desires, desires that are fueled by ignorance, I amness, attachments and repulsions, and instinctive self-preservation. So what is the human being? The human being is that totality. Our problem is in the middle. Just skipping back before we close for today. There's nothing wrong. The functioning principles on the left would be the functioning principles of an enlightened, self-realized human being, and also the functioning principles of someone like me. This is how the human being functions. There is a physical body, there is the etheric body, there is the place where all the passions reside, there is a place where all the thoughts reside, there is a place where the spiritual intelligence resides. This is true of everybody, but the self-realized person would not have problems created in that middle, by the middleman there, the lower mind. There would not be problems created by the lower mind. In my case, the lower mind is constantly running my chariot over into the ditch. That is my problem.